It started like any ordinary morning in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place that pretends to be peaceful on the surface while tension quietly builds behind perfectly trimmed hedges and identical mailboxes. The kind of neighborhood where property lines are sacred on paper but constantly questioned in practice, especially when an aggressive HOA board begins to believe control matters more than fairness. The narrator had lived in this home long enough to understand its rhythms. The driveway was not just concrete, it was part of the property's original design, purchased and legally recorded years before the HOA even tightened its grip on the community. It was supposed to be private, respected, untouched. But change arrived one afternoon in the form of a new neighbor. She moved in quietly at first, but her presence was anything but quiet in practice. She quickly gained a reputation for inserting herself into matters that did not concern her, especially anything involving parking, shared spaces, or perceived rule violations. Within days, she began observing the neighborhood with an intensity that felt less like curiosity and more like surveillance. Then came the first incident. One morning, the narrator stepped outside expecting the familiar sight of their own vehicle parked neatly in their driveway. Instead, they found another car occupying the space completely. At first, it looked like a simple mistake, a temporary misunderstanding. But something about the placement felt deliberate, as if the space had been claimed rather than borrowed. The HOA soon became involved, as it always did in escalating situations like this. Instead of resolving the issue fairly, the board's response introduced confusion. Policies were suddenly interpreted in new ways, vague rules were cited, and responsibility was deflected. The new neighbor, often referred to internally by residents as the HO Karen, positioned herself as an unofficial authority, insisting that the driveway in question was part of a shared parking arrangement, despite no such agreement existing in any legal document. What made the situation worse was how quickly control began shifting. Notices appeared on doors, some vaguely worded, others aggressively phrased, suggesting violations that did not exist a week earlier. The HOA board seemed unusually responsive to the new neighbor's complaints, almost as if she had become an extension of their authority rather than just a resident. The narrator attempted to address the issue calmly at first, relying on documentation, property records, and the original purchase agreement. But every attempt to clarify ownership was met with procedural delays, meetings that led nowhere, and interpretations of rules that changed depending on who was speaking. Meanwhile, the driveway continued to be used by others, sometimes openly, sometimes under the justification of temporary necessity. Each instance chipped away at the sense of control over the property. What was once a clear personal space slowly began to feel contested, as if ownership itself were being questioned. Tension in the neighborhood began to grow. Other residents started noticing similar behavior, small but unsettling patterns of overreach from the HOA and increasing influence from the new neighbor. Some avoided involvement altogether, hoping the situation would resolve itself. Others quietly expressed concern but hesitated to speak openly, aware of how quickly disputes could turn into formal complaints. The narrator, however, could not ignore it. The driveway represented more than convenience. It was a boundary, a legal certainty being eroded by social pressure and administrative manipulation. Then came the turning point. One evening, after another unauthorized use of the driveway, the narrator discovered something unexpected. Surveillance footage from a neighbor's camera revealed that the HOA enforcement guidance was not being applied evenly. Some residents were exempt from rules entirely, while others were targeted repeatedly. The new neighbor appeared frequently in these clips, not just using influence but actively directing others on where to park, what to report, and which properties should be reviewed. It was no longer about parking. It was about control. And the driveway was just the beginning. By the end of that day, the narrator realized this was not a misunderstanding that could be resolved through polite conversation or standard HOA channels. It had become something deeper, something structured, almost intentional in its imbalance. A system had formed, quietly but firmly, and the driveway was its first visible battleground. What followed would not remain contained to one property for long, and the narrator was no longer willing to stay silent. By the time the situation reached its second phase, the neighborhood no longer felt like a quiet residential space. It felt like a controlled environment where boundaries existed only on paper and enforcement depended entirely on influence rather than law. The driveway dispute had become the center of a much larger pattern, one that was slowly revealing itself through small but deliberate acts of overreach. The narrator began documenting everything with increasing precision, every instance of unauthorized parking, every inconsistency in HOA enforcement, every moment where the rules seemed to bend in favor of the same individual. What initially looked like petty neighborhood conflict was now forming into something far more structured, as if someone had quietly taken control of the system from within. The HOA board, instead of correcting course, appeared to tighten its stance. Notices increased in frequency, each one more vaguely threatening than the last. The language of enforcement shifted subtly, focusing less on actual violations and more on interpretations of community harmony, a phrase that seemed to justify nearly any action taken against dissenting residents. Meanwhile, the new neighbor's influence expanded. She was no longer simply reporting issues, she was shaping how issues were defined. Parking regulations, once straightforward, were suddenly reinterpreted in ways that conveniently supported her position. The driveway, still legally private, was repeatedly described in official communications as accessible under shared conditions. Despite no legal amendment supporting such a claim, the narrator noticed a pattern emerging. Every time documentation was presented to the HOA, responses would be delayed, redirected, or reframed. Instead of addressing ownership, the board began questioning compliance with newly emphasized procedural guidelines. It was no longer about who owned the driveway. It was about whether ownership could be challenged through bureaucracy. Tension spread further through the community. Some residents began receiving similar treatment, particularly those who questioned parking assignments or raised concerns about selective enforcement. Vehicles were ticketed inconsistently, rules were enforced unevenly, and exceptions appeared to cluster around the same influential figures. The narrator's driveway, however, remained the central point of conflict. On several occasions, vehicles were parked there without permission for extended periods. Each time, the explanation provided through HOA channels was vague, often referencing temporary adjustments or misunderstandings that were never actually corrected. What made the situation more unsettling was the growing sense of coordination. It was no longer random. The timing of enforcement actions, the arrival of notices, and the presence of the new neighbor during disputes suggested a level of organization that went beyond casual influence. It felt orchestrated. The narrator began to suspect that the HOA board was no longer acting independently. Meetings were held behind closed doors more frequently, and decisions began appearing fully formed without clear discussion. The new neighbor's role became more visible in indirect ways, through outcomes rather than direct participation. Despite mounting frustration, the narrator continued gathering evidence. Property documents were re-examined, historical records were reviewed, and satellite imagery was consulted to confirm the original boundaries of the driveway. Every source reinforced the same conclusion: the space was private, exclusive, and legally protected. Yet reality on the ground told a different story. By this point, the driveway had effectively become contested territory, not through legal transfer, but through repeated unauthorized use combined with institutional hesitation to intervene. The more it was used without consequence, the more normalized the violation became. Then came a shift that changed everything again. One evening, the narrator discovered that formal complaint records had been altered in the HOA system. Entries that previously supported the narrator's claims were missing or modified. The changes were subtle, but unmistakable. It was not just enforcement bias anymore. It was administrative interference. The realization hit hard. This was no longer a simple property dispute. It was a coordinated erosion of rights disguised as community governance. And the most alarming part was that it was still escalating. The narrator understood, if this continued unchecked, the driveway would not remain an isolated issue. It would become a precedent for every other boundary in the neighborhood. The conflict was no longer about parking. It was about who controlled the rules themselves. And that control was slipping further away with each passing day. By the third stage of the conflict, the situation had evolved beyond a simple neighborhood disagreement. It was no longer about a single driveway or even a single resident. It had become a structured power imbalance operating through procedural manipulation, selective enforcement, and administrative control masked as community governance. The narrator could feel the shift in real time. Every attempt to correct the situation through official channels now triggered a predictable cycle: acknowledgement, delay, reinterpretation, and finally dismissal. The HOA had become less of a governing body and more of a filter that reshaped reality depending on who applied pressure most effectively. The new neighbor, now firmly embedded within the HOA's decision-making influence, continued expanding her reach. Her role was no longer informal. Even without formal title changes, her presence in decisions was obvious through outcomes. Parking assignments shifted after her complaints. Enforcement notices followed her reports almost immediately, and most importantly, objections raised against her actions rarely progressed beyond initial review stages. The driveway remained the central battleground, but its symbolic weight had increased. What once was a private space had now become a test case for authority within the neighborhood. Every unauthorized use reinforced the same pattern. Persistence led to acceptance, and acceptance slowly rewrote expectations. The narrator began noticing something even more concerning. Other residents were adapting to the system rather than resisting it. People who previously followed clear property boundaries began adjusting their behavior to avoid attention. Parking habits changed. Communication with the HOA became cautious. Silence started replacing resistance, not out of agreement but out of fatigue. Meanwhile, the administrative structure continued to tighten. Requests for clarification were met with references to updated internal guidelines that were never formally distributed. These guidelines appeared to exist only in practice, not in transparent documentation. The effect was subtle but powerful. Rules existed, but they could not be reliably verified. The narrator attempted to escalate the issue beyond the HOA, reaching into municipal oversight channels. But even there, responses were procedural and slow. The dispute was categorized as an internal community matter, limiting external intervention. This classification effectively trapped the conflict inside the HOA's jurisdiction, where influence was already heavily skewed. At the same time, surveillance of the property increased indirectly, not through official monitoring, but through neighbor activity. More people seemed aware of the narrator's schedule. Vehicles appeared and disappeared from the driveway at strategic times. The pattern suggested coordination, though no direct evidence linked it to a formal directive. The psychological pressure of the situation began to mount. It was no longer just about losing access to a physical space. It was about the erosion of certainty. The narrator could no longer assume that documented ownership guaranteed control. Each day introduced new interpretations of the same facts, all of them shifting slightly away from established rights. Then a critical development occurred. A revised HOA notice circulated through the neighborhood, introducing a community parking optimization initiative. The language was deliberately vague, emphasizing shared benefit and improved access. However, in practice, it expanded discretionary authority over private driveways under the justification of temporary logistical adjustments. The narrator immediately recognized the implications. This was not a clarification. It was a structural expansion of control designed to legitimize what had already been happening informally. Soon after, the driveway was used again under this new justification. No permission was requested. No explanation was provided beyond reference to the new policy. The act was presented as procedural rather than personal, as if ownership had been quietly reclassified through wording alone. At this point, the narrator understood the trajectory clearly. If left unchecked, each informal violation would eventually become formalized policy. The system was not just ignoring boundaries, it was actively rewriting them. And the most dangerous part was how normal it was starting to feel to everyone else. What remained of resistance was now concentrated in a single point: whether the narrator would continue documenting, continue challenging, and continue refusing to accept the gradual rewriting of property rights. The conflict was no longer external alone. It was becoming institutional, and the next escalation was already forming inside the HOA itself. By the fourth chapter of the conflict, the quiet illusion of neighborhood order had completely collapsed. What remained was a structured imbalance that no longer bothered to disguise itself behind polite language or procedural ambiguity. The HOA system, once presented as a neutral governing body, now functioned like a closed loop of influence where decisions consistently benefited the same source of pressure. The narrator began to see the pattern with uncomfortable clarity. This was no longer about isolated parking disputes or misunderstood guidelines. It was about authority being quietly redirected through repetition until what was unofficial gradually became accepted as normal. The driveway, still legally owned and clearly documented, had become the most visible example of this shift. Each day introduced new layers of enforcement behavior that lacked consistency. Some residents were warned for minor infractions, while others were allowed repeated violations without consequence. The justification always changed, but the outcome remained the same. The new neighbor's presence continued to align with every major shift in enforcement direction, even when she was not formally mentioned in communications. The narrator noticed that HOA meetings had become less about discussion and more about confirmation. Decisions appeared predetermined, with little room for actual debate. When concerns were raised about parking rights or property boundaries, the responses were increasingly procedural, redirecting attention away from substance and toward technical compliance with newly introduced interpretations. At this stage, the driveway issue escalated from misuse to systematic occupation. Vehicles began appearing more frequently, sometimes staying for longer durations, as if testing how far the boundary could be pushed before resistance would appear. Each time the narrator attempted to reassert control, the response from the HOA referenced shifting policies or temporary allowances that were never clearly defined in writing. The most troubling development was how quickly these changes were absorbed by the neighborhood. Residents who once viewed the situation as unusual began adapting to it. Some started parking differently to avoid attention. Others stopped questioning enforcement decisions altogether. A culture of passive acceptance began forming, not because people agreed, but because resistance seemed increasingly ineffective. The narrator, however, continued documenting everything: every unauthorized use of the driveway, every inconsistent notice, every contradiction between recorded property rights and actual enforcement behavior was carefully logged. The evidence painted a clear picture of gradual systemic drift, where authority was no longer anchored in original legal frameworks, but in repeated administrative reinterpretation. Then came a decisive escalation. A formal HOA directive was issued, introducing what was described as a community flexibility clause. On the surface, it appeared to be an effort to improve parking efficiency. In reality, it granted expanded discretionary power to allocate driveway usage in situations deemed community beneficial, without requiring explicit owner consent. The language was carefully constructed, vague enough to appear reasonable while broad enough to justify almost any action. The narrator immediately understood the danger. This clause effectively transformed private property into conditionally shared space, based entirely on HOA interpretation. Within days of its introduction, The driveway was reassigned under this new clause. The narrator's access was not formally revoked, but it was no longer exclusive. The justification referenced community optimization and temporary redistribution, despite no measurable emergency or shortage that would require such measures. What made the situation worse was the confidence with which it was enforced. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. The change was presented as finalized policy, not as a discussion point. The new neighbor's influence, though never explicitly stated, was unmistakably aligned with the outcome. At this point, the narrator recognized a critical shift. The conflict was no longer about winning individual disputes. It was about whether the original property rights could survive within a system that was actively redefining them through procedural expansion. The emotional weight of the situation deepened. The driveway, once a symbol of control and ownership, had become a symbol of how quickly structure could erode when oversight was fragmented and influence concentrated. Every attempt to correct the imbalance now required navigating a system that seemed increasingly designed to resist correction. And still, the escalation had not reached its peak. Behind closed doors, further adjustments were already being discussed. The language of future notices suggested even broader authority, hinting at permanent reclassification of certain private areas under community-managed usage. The narrator realized that if this continued unchecked, the concept of private property in the neighborhood would no longer remain stable. It would become negotiable. And the next chapter would determine whether resistance still had any structural ground left to stand on. By the fifth stage of the conflict, the neighborhood no longer resembled the place the narrator had originally moved into. The familiar sense of order had been replaced by something more rigid, more opaque, and far more difficult to challenge. The HOA system had evolved from a governing structure into an enforcement mechanism that operated primarily through reinterpretation rather than clear rulemaking. The driveway dispute, once a localized issue, had now become a precedent-setting example within the community. Every action taken against it carried implications for every other property boundary. The narrator understood this clearly now. If the driveway could be reclassified through procedural language, then nothing in the neighborhood was truly stable. The new neighbor's influence had reached its peak visibility, though never formally acknowledged. Her presence could be felt in every decision affecting parking allocation and enforcement priorities. The HOA board, once expected to act as a neutral mediator, now appeared to function as a reinforcing layer for outcomes already shaped before meetings even began. The narrator observed a concerning transformation in how enforcement was justified. Instead of referencing fixed regulations, the HOA began relying on abstract principles like community efficiency, shared benefit optimization, and adaptive space management. These phrases carried no measurable boundaries, which made them powerful tools for reshaping outcomes without appearing to break rules. The driveway, still legally documented as private property, was now repeatedly categorized under temporary allocation status. Each reclassification extended its unauthorized use while maintaining the illusion of procedural legitimacy. The narrator's objections, supported by official property records, were acknowledged but consistently redirected into review cycles that never concluded meaningfully. What made this stage particularly alarming was the normalization of the behavior. Residents who once questioned the inconsistency of enforcement now accepted it as part of daily life. The gradual shift had worked. What began as an obvious overreach had become routine administration. The system had successfully absorbed resistance simply by outlasting it. The narrator began to notice that the HOA's communication style had also changed. Notices became longer, more complex, and deliberately ambiguous. The increasing use of layered terminology made it difficult for any single statement to be directly challenged without requiring extensive interpretation. This complexity itself functioned as a barrier to accountability. Meanwhile, the driveway was no longer just being used, It was being integrated into a broader pattern of shared resource allocation. Vehicles appeared according to an informal rotation system that had no official documentation but was consistently enforced in practice. Any deviation from this pattern triggered immediate administrative reminders referencing community balance requirements. At this point, the narrator realized the situation had crossed into structural territory. This was no longer a dispute that could be resolved through documentation alone. The system itself had adapted to override documentation. Ownership existed on paper, but access was being governed through evolving interpretation. A critical development occurred when the HOA introduced an updated governance framework. This framework did not explicitly revoke private property rights, but it introduced conditional usage clauses that effectively subordinated those rights to community-defined necessity. The language was carefully constructed to appear voluntary, but in practice it left little room for refusal. Under this framework, the driveway's status became officially categorized as conditionally integrated private access space. This designation allowed the HOA to justify continued shared usage without requiring explicit transfer of ownership. It represented a shift from enforcement to structural redefinition. The narrator recognized the implications immediately. If unchallenged, this framework would not remain limited to a single property. It could be applied to any driveway, any yard, any private space deemed logistically relevant to community operations. The precedent being set was far larger than the original conflict. Emotionally, the weight of the situation intensified. What had once been a straightforward property disagreement had transformed into a sustained erosion of certainty. The narrator was no longer dealing with isolated incidents, but with a system that continuously adapted to preserve its own decisions. And still, the escalation had not stabilized. Behind the scenes, further adjustments were being drafted that hinted at even broader authority. References to dynamic property utility models began appearing in internal summaries, suggesting that the current changes were only an intermediate stage. The narrator understood now that the conflict had reached its most critical phase. The remaining question was no longer whether the driveway would be restored, but whether any clear boundary between private ownership and HOA control would survive at all. By the time the final chapter of the conflict began, the neighborhood had already crossed a threshold it did not fully understand. What started as a single disputed driveway had evolved into a complete redefinition of how authority functioned within the HOA system. The narrator was no longer dealing with isolated violations or inconsistent enforcement. This was now a fully operational structure that sustained itself through policy language, procedural layering, and collective compliance. The driveway remained at the center of it all, but its meaning had changed. It was no longer just a private space being misused. It had become a test case for how far institutional interpretation could stretch before it snapped. Every vehicle placed there, every notice issued, and every justification provided had contributed to reshaping what ownership meant in practice. The narrator, however, had reached a different conclusion. Instead of continuing to engage through the same channels that had been steadily neutralized, attention shifted toward understanding the system's dependency points. Every administrative structure, no matter how rigid it appears, relies on certain assumptions: consistency, procedural validity, and the belief that records reflect reality. And that was where the weakness existed. Over time, the narrator had carefully documented every inconsistency, every contradictory notice, and every instance where enforcement diverged from recorded policy. What initially seemed like isolated frustration had become a structured archive of procedural breakdowns. The key realization was simple but powerful: the system had not been operating outside rules, it had been operating by selectively rewriting them without proper alignment to its own records. The HOA, in its effort to maintain control, had accumulated contradictions that could not all coexist under formal review. Notices referencing different versions of policy, altered complaint logs, and overlapping authority claims created a fragile internal structure. It appeared stable only because no one had forced it to reconcile all its parts at once. The turning point came when the narrator formally requested a consolidated audit of all parking-related decisions affecting the property. Unlike previous complaints, this request was structured in a way that required full documentation alignment across multiple records. It was not emotional, not reactive, but procedural and precise. For the first time, the system hesitated. The response cycle that once produced quick rejections and vague explanations slowed significantly. Internal contradictions began surfacing as records were compared side by side. The community flexibility clause, the temporary allocation framework, and the conditional integration designation could not all be applied simultaneously without exposing inconsistencies in authority hierarchy. Within the neighborhood, tension quietly shifted. The same residents who had previously adapted to the new parking system began noticing irregularities in enforcement consistency. The predictability that had once reinforced compliance started breaking down under scrutiny. The new neighbor, whose influence had shaped much of the previous escalation, remained active but now operated within a more constrained environment. Decisions linked to her earlier directives were being evaluated against formal records. What had once been accepted without question was now being compared against documented authority, and the gaps were becoming harder to ignore. The driveway, still physically occupied at times, was now caught in administrative uncertainty. Each attempt to justify its shared use required referencing policies that no longer aligned cleanly with updated interpretations. The system that once expanded effortlessly was now forced to reconcile itself. And then, quietly, the shift occurred. The HOA issued a revised clarification notice. Not a new expansion of authority, but a partial retraction of previous interpretations. Language that had once supported broad discretionary control was narrowed. References to conditional usage were restricted. The most expansive claims of shared access were quietly walked back into more limited terms. No dramatic announcement followed. No confrontation took place. The change appeared as a technical correction, but its impact was structural. The driveway's status reverted closer to its original classification, restoring exclusivity without acknowledging the reversal explicitly. The narrator did not celebrate. There was no need for that. The outcome was not the result of confrontation, but of forcing the system to account for itself completely. The HOA, in attempting to extend control too broadly, had overcomplicated its own framework, and in doing so, it lost the ability to maintain consistent enforcement across its own records. By the end, the lesson was clear, though unspoken in any official communication. Control that depends on contradiction cannot sustain itself indefinitely. The driveway returned to quiet use. The neighborhood slowly settled back into its familiar rhythm, though something had permanently changed beneath the surface. Residents now understood, even if only instinctively, that authority was not absolute when it could be forced to reconcile with its own documentation. And the narrator finally reclaimed what had never been legally lost, only temporarily distorted by overreach.